Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she receives an invitation to a dinner party, one that no one admits to. Sending. The handwriting is unfamiliar, the seal is broken, and the address leads to a house that's supposed to be empty. Yet when the clock strikes 8, the door opens, and the table is already set. Stay with me till the end, because the name on that invitation isn't just unexpected, it's impossible. So, pour yourself a cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's mystery is worth every second until the very end. Chapter 1. The Garden Party That Shouldn't Have Been. Sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of cottages in the quiet village of Heathercombe, bathing every rosebush and pebble path in a golden late May glow. It was the sort of afternoon that encouraged gossip over garden gates, tea taken under blooming wisteria, and soft mutterings about the state of Mrs. Dunwoody's petunias. The morning had started like any other in the village, peaceful, ordinary, rather quaint, until, quite suddenly, it wasn't. The source of the upheaval was a cream-colored envelope, the kind used for weddings or funerals, though in Heathercombe it was often hard to tell the difference. Inside were gilded letters announcing a garden party at Ivy Hollow, the stately but rather lonely home of Mr. Alastair Hawthorne. No one knew Mr. Hawthorne to be the entertaining sort, a retired barrister with a stiff manner and a famously sharp tongue. He'd lived as a recluse since his wife's mysterious drowning some 15 years ago. So naturally, when Miss Sybil Ackerman found the invitation resting atop her copy of the parish weekly, she assumed it must be a mistake, except that she wasn't the only one. By mid-morning, no less than 8 villagers, all longtime residents, and some barely on speaking terms, had received the same curious invitation. Handwritten, no postage, no messenger, no indication of why or how the cards had appeared. "I suppose it could be his birthday," ventured Mrs. Edgecombe, the vicar's wife, clutching her invitation with a trembling hand. "Though no one knows quite when he was born. If it is, he's aged terribly for 60, muttered Mr. Lawrence Pike, the grocer, who had always suspected Hawthorne of being closer to 80. By midday, the air was thick with speculation and nervous excitement. Who had sent the invitations? Was it really from Mr. Hawthorne? And if so, why now? Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly near the window of her ivy-covered cottage with a ball of mauve yarn in her lap, listened without speaking as her young niece-in-law, Rosalind, read the invitation aloud for the 3rd time. "I do hope it's not a prank," Rosalind said, frowning. "It feels strange, Aunt Jane, especially considering how rarely he leaves the house." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a moment, her pale blue eyes distant. "Strange things often come dressed in proper paper," she murmured. "It's the hallmark of English wickedness, very tidy on the outside." Rosalind gave a nervous laugh. "You're not suggesting there's something wrong with a harmless little party?" No, Miss Marple replied with a serene smile. "Not at all. Only that when people who don't normally entertain start inviting strangers to tea, one must wonder what it is they really wanted to serve." By 4 o'clock, the guests had arrived, 10 of them in total, drifting into Ivy Hollow's wide, overgrown garden like uncertain moths to a mismatched flame. Miss Marple arrived last, arm in arm with Rosalind, and was greeted with the unmistakable scent of overripe lilacs, and something else, something faintly metallic beneath the blossom. The garden, though beautiful in a disheveled way, had an uneasy stillness to it, like a room prepared for someone who never arrived. And then, as the clock on the garden wall struck 4:30, the host finally emerged. Alastair Hawthorne looked older than anyone remembered. His once proud figure now stooped, with a tremor in his fingers as he poured himself a glass of sherry. He greeted no one directly, offered no toast, no speech, and sat in a wicker chair beneath a sycamore tree as though observing his own funeral. The guests exchanged glances. Rosalind leaned closer to her aunt. "I don't think he invited us at all," she whispered. Miss Marple didn't reply. She was watching Mr. Hawthorne very closely, not his face, but the way he looked at the guests. Not recognition, not joy. Fear. And 20 minutes later, just after the tea was served, Mr. Alistair Hawthorne collapsed sideways in his chair, his teacup falling from his hand with a soft clatter. By the time Dr. Reeves was summoned from across the green, it was too late. Hawthorne was dead, and no one, absolutely no one, could prove they had invited anyone to the garden party. Chapter 2, Whispers. Beneath the wisteria by the time the church bells struck 6, the village of Heathercombe was already ablaze with speculation. The body of Alistair Hawthorne had been respectfully covered with a picnic blanket and left beneath the sycamore, as though merely dozing off after a rather disappointing party. The guests had been instructed to remain in the garden while the local constable, young Sergeant Chooks, made his reluctant entrance. It wasn't the sort of case he fancied. He was more accustomed to directing lost tourists or helping Mrs. Bellingham retrieve her cat from trees. Murder, if indeed it was murder, was far beyond his comfort or training. Heart failure, perhaps, muttered Dr. Reeves, peering at Hawthorne's still form with the practiced detachment of a village doctor. But sudden, oddly sudden, and not a man I'd have pegged for frailty, even at his age. Sergeant Chooks nodded solemnly, attempting to look authoritative. "We'll have to make inquiries, interviews, proper statements and such." Miss Marple, sitting unobtrusively on a low stone bench near the lilac bushes, kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was not watching the body. She was watching the guests. It was a curious assembly, 10 people, each one with their own subtle expression of guilt, surprise, or vague alarm, though none seemed quite matched to the situation. Not grief. Not yet. "I suppose we'll all be considered suspects now," muttered Mr. Pike, the grocer, tugging at his collar. "Nonsense," scoffed Sybil Ackerman, though she clutched her handbag a little tighter. "You can't murder someone at a tea party. It's not done. Everything is done somewhere," Miss Marple said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. Sergeant Chooks began gathering the guests one by one for questioning under the watchful eye of Dr. Reeves, who lingered nearby with a handkerchief pressed to his forehead. They started with Mrs. Edgecombe, the vicar's wife, who fluttered like a startled partridge. "He didn't even speak, really," she said. "Just sat there looking lost. I thought perhaps he was ill before we arrived." "And when did you last see Mr. Hawthorne before today?" Chooks asked. "Oh, years. At the Christmas service, I think. Or was it the Queen's Jubilee picnic?" "No. Wait, he sent a donation for the roof repair. A check. Quite generous. Did you know him well?" "No one knew him well, dear." Rosalind, who sat beside Miss Marple while waiting for her turn, leaned in. "Is it wrong that I feel a bit relieved? I mean, the whole thing felt off from the start." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Relief is simply your good sense noting danger has passed. That doesn't make it wrong. But if no one invited us, then someone wanted us here," Miss Marple finished. Whether or not Mr. Hawthorne shared the intention, the interviews proceeded slowly. Miss Sybil Ackerman insisted she had received her invitation on her doorstep that morning and had come only out of politeness. "I do not like the man," she declared flatly. "He was smug and cold and very cruel about my rhododendrons when he judged the flower show in 32. Mr. Pike, still red-faced, admitted he had no personal dealings with Hawthorne since a legal dispute over a boundary hedge 10 years earlier. Not a man to forgive nor to forget. You couldn't trust him with a neighbor's ladder. let alone tea. Others offered similar half-remembered grievances, none recent, but all colored by the same undertone. Mr. Hawthorne had been no friend to anyone, and yet, here they all were. Sergeant Chooks frowned over his notes. It's odd, though, isn't it? You all received invitations, but no one seems to know who sent them. That doesn't just happen. It does in fiction, Rosalind offered, a little too brightly. Those locked room stories you read in magazines. Miss Marple's gaze drifted past the hedgerow, toward Ivy Hollow itself. The house loomed over the garden like an aging sentinel, stone-faced, cold-windowed, and still very much alive with secrets. She'd only been inside once, decades ago, when Mrs. Hawthorne was still living and the garden was properly tended. There's something unnatural about invitations with no sender, she said softly, as though to the hydrangeas, in a village like ours, where everyone knows everyone's business. Anonymity is as suspicious as a fox at a baptism. As dusk crept over the garden, the guests were dismissed, though not without firm instruction from Sergeant Chooks, to remain in the village. Can't be too careful, he added, more for his own comfort than theirs. Miss Marple rose with surprising ease for a woman of her years and offered Rosalind her arm. They walked in companionable silence along the cobbled lane, past the baker's, past the church, until the ivy-laced gate of their own cottage came into view. Inside, the kettle was set to boil, and the day's strangeness seemed temporarily held at bay by the scent of Earl Grey and the soft ticking of the wall clock. I should feel terrible, Rosalind said at last, but I can't help thinking if he didn't invite us, then who did? And why now? Miss Marple, seated once more with her knitting, looked thoughtful. It was no accident, she said. It was a summons, and not for tea. Rosalind blinked. A summons? Miss Marple gave a slight nod. Murder, my dear, is rarely spontaneous, especially not in a place like Heathercombe. It begins quietly like root rot in a garden. By the time the leaves start to wither, the damage is already done. From the mantel, the clock struck 8. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. Outside, the village lights flickered on one by one, illuminating neat hedges and closed curtains. But behind those curtains, the whispers had already begun. Alistair Hawthorne is dead. No one invited them. Someone must have wanted it to happen. And in a quiet cottage lined with floral wallpaper and porcelain teacups, Miss Marple cast off another row of yarn and pondered the peculiar mathematics of 10 invitations, 1 corpse and 0 senders. Chapter 3. The first suspect be the following morning. The delicate balance of Heathercombe's routines had tipped into quiet chaos. Milk deliveries were delayed. Miss Godfrey's knitting circle was cancelled out of respect. Even the postman lingered unusually long at doorsteps, his usual indifference replaced by an eagerness to exchange the latest murmurs about Mr. Hawthorne's demise. At the village green, Mrs. Edgecombe spoke in hushed tones with the butcher's wife about how Mr. Hawthorne had looked rather pale for weeks. Near the bakery, Lawrence Pike swore up and down that he saw Hawthorne arguing with someone in his driveway just days before the incident, though the figure in question remained conveniently nameless. Speculation thickened like the morning fog. Inside the drawing room of her modest cottage, Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea for herself and for Rosalind, who looked more restless than usual. I couldn't sleep a wink last night, Rosalind admitted. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept wondering if we hadn't gone to the garden party. Would he still be alive? Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, letting the teaspoon clink once, then twice, perhaps, she said, or perhaps someone was counting on that precise moment. Rosalind frowned. But how could someone know when he'd die? That's assuming he simply died. Miss Marple murmured, and not that he was helped along. A knock at the door interrupted them sharp. Official. Rosalind opened it to find Sergeant Chooks standing rather sheepishly, head in hand. "Good morning, Miss Marple, Miss Rosalind. I do hope I'm not intruding, but well, something's come up. Dr. Reeves just delivered the preliminary report." Miss Marple motioned him in with a nod, and he stood stiffly just inside the doorway, clearly uncomfortable. "It wasn't a heart attack," he said, "not natural causes. The tea Hawthorne drank showed signs of digitalis, in concentrated form, from foxglove." Rosalind gasped. "Poison." Chooks nodded grimly. "Yes, someone murdered him, and, since only the people in that garden were present when he drank it." He let the implication hang. Miss Marple set her teacup down without a tremble. "Then I imagine you'll be starting with the person who made or poured the tea exactly," said Chooks. "And that's what's strange. No one seems to recall seeing anyone serve it directly. It wasn't one big pot. We found several cups arranged on the tray. And they weren't all the same pattern. The maid, the old one who sometimes helps at Ivy Hollow, Elsie Meacham, says she didn't make the tea. She just brought it out, as instructed. Said it was waiting for her in the kitchen. So someone had time to prepare the tray before the guests arrived," Miss Marple said, "and chose to do so without being seen. Yes, and we think we know who." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Mr. Pike, Lawrence Pike, was seen near the Hawthorne property round noon the day before the party. When questioned, he claimed he'd stopped by to drop off an invoice for a grocery delivery. But Hawthorne didn't answer the door." Miss Marple arched an eyebrow. "Curious. I thought Mr. Hawthorne hadn't taken deliveries from Pike's shop in over a year. Said something about preferring items shipped directly from London." "Exactly," Chooks said. "So why would Pike show up unannounced with an invoice? And more importantly, why lie about it?" Rosalind blinked. "Do you think he snuck in and tampered with the tea things? Possibly. We found his fingerprints on a porcelain cup in the Hawthorne kitchen, one not used during the party. But it shows he was inside the house at some point, without a known reason." "Have you spoken to him again?" Miss Marple asked. "Briefly. He denied everything. Said he may have gone up to the door, maybe touched something by mistake. He was vague, defensive." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, retrieving her shawl. "Then I believe it's time I visit Mr. Pike." Sergeant Chooks opened his mouth, as though to object, then closed it again. Miss Marple was, after all, not the sort of woman you refused, and besides, in his heart, he knew she'd likely see things he could not. Mr. Pike's grocery stood on the edge of the village square, its window boasting dusty tins of treacle and ginger biscuits from another season. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and pickled onions. He looked up as the bell over the door jingled. "Miss Marple," he said stiffly, "here to shop, or to ask more questions on behalf of our beloved constable?" "Neither, really," she replied pleasantly, "though I wouldn't mind a bit of that lemon curd. It's so difficult to find a good batch nowadays." He hesitated, then fetched a jar from the back shelf. "You don't believe I had anything to do with it, do you?" Miss Marple smiled, noncommittal. "I find it's best not to believe too much of anything too quickly. Belief, like butter, can spoil when left out." Mr. Pike snorted, but tension lined his face. "It's absurd. I didn't kill him. We didn't like each other, true, but that's hardly motive." "Not always," Miss Marple agreed. "But I do recall your brother worked in legal chambers with Mr. Hawthorne, left the practice under some unfortunate circumstances, did he not?" Pike stiffened. "That was years ago, and has nothing to do with me. Perhaps," she said lightly, "though family pride runs deep, especially in men who live alone and value their name above all else." He said nothing. Miss Marple paid for her curd and stepped out into the sunlight, her expression unreadable. As she walked slowly back toward the cottage, a thought stirred in her mind, not fully formed, but distinct. The tea had been waiting before the party began. The cups weren't matching, and someone familiar enough with the kitchen had known which one Hawthorne would choose. She paused beneath the wisteria archway outside the church gate, breathing in its heavy scent. No, Mr. Pike didn't strike her as the type to stage a murder so delicately. His temper was too loud to red in the face, no subtlety, and murder at a garden party, served with cake that required quiet bitterness and precision. She resumed walking. This wasn't about poison. Not really. This was about why the invitations had gone out in the first place and who had something to gain by bringing everyone back to Ivy Hollow, not to see the man alive, but to see him dead. Chapter 4. A hidden clue. The days following Mr. Hawthorne's death took on a rhythm of unease. Heather Comby's outward charm remained untouched. Flower boxes still bloomed, the bakery still sold scones dusted with sugar, and the vicar's sermons still carried politely over the pews. But underneath, the village pulsed with nerves. Eyes watched too long over garden fences. Conversations grew shorter, clipped with uncertainty. Everyone wondered who poisoned Alistair Hawthorne, and who would be next. At the heart of this quiet unrest, Miss Marple moved like a needle through silk, unobtrusive, methodical, absorbing details. On Thursday morning, she visited Ivy Hollow again, this time at the request of Sergeant Chooks, who had, quite without realizing it, grown to depend on her presence in the investigation. "I've cleared it with the inspector," he told her at the gate, awkwardly holding open the iron latch. "We've finished our sweep. You may look about, if you like." The house was still, the air inside faintly musty with the scent of unopened rooms and old books. The drawing room was untouched since the day of the garden party, except for the absence of its owner. A slight chill lingered in the corners, and the wallpaper, once elegant, was beginning to peel where the sun no longer reached. Miss Marple made no comment. She simply walked. She examined the tea tray first, now sitting on a side table near the window, untouched since the police had catalogued it. There were 7 cups, only one of them chipped. Her fingers hovered over it, but she didn't touch. Instead, her eyes drifted to a sideboard nearby, where a delicate silver-framed photograph stood alone. It was of a woman severe in posture, unsmiling but elegant. Mrs. Eliza Hawthorne, long dead, yet still present, watching over the room like a portrait in a Gothic novel. Miss Marple tilted her head. Rosalind stepped into the room, brushing dust from her skirt. "Oh, that's her, isn't it? The wife who drowned." "Yes, but look closer. Her hand. Do you see what she's wearing?" Rosalind squinted. "A ring." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "A very particular one. On her right hand." Rosalind leaned in. "A cameo?" "Yes, I've seen that ring before." "Where?" Miss Marple gave her a faint smile. "That is what I intend to find out." They explored the rest of the ground floor slowly. Lingering in the kitchen, Miss Marple stood for a long while in front of the open spice cupboard. "Curious," she murmured. "What is?" Rosalind asked. Miss Marple pointed. "There's an entire jar missing. Ground nutmeg. See the slight ring of residue on the shelf? It was there recently, and now it's not." Rosalind looked confused. "Nutmeg. Not the weapon, of course," Miss Marple said gently. "But it suggests that someone's been working in this kitchen, perhaps preparing more than just tea. Do you think whoever made the poisoned tea also tampered with the spice rack? Possibly. Or possibly they only wanted us to think they were preparing something ordinary. A distraction. Poison is like a whisper. My dear, it works best when it goes unnoticed." They left Ivy Hollow not long after, with Miss Marple noticeably quiet on the walk home. That afternoon, she wrote 3 brief notes, each folded neatly and delivered by hand, one to Sybil Ackerman, one to Elsie Meacham, and one to Reverend Willoughby's housekeeper, Miss Finch. By early evening, only one had responded. Elsie Meacham arrived with hands clasped and eyes darting, clearly unused to being summoned to tea. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said warmly. "Please, sit." Elsie sat as though unsure whether the chair might collapse beneath her. "I haven't done anything wrong, Miss Marple," she said at once. "I swear it. I just bring the tea and dust the books. I don't go poking where I shouldn't." "Of course not," Miss Marple said. "You were very kind to help during the party. It must have been an odd request, though." Elsie hesitated. "Well, yes. I mean, I haven't worked there regular since the missus died. And even then, it were only every other Friday. And who called you back?" "It weren't a call," she said. "A note left on my doorstep. Just like the others." Miss Marple blinked. "You received one of the invitations?" "No," Elsie said. "Not a fancy card. Just a bit of torn paper. Said, 'Come to Ivy Hollow at 3. Help with garden party. You'll be paid, that's all.'" "And was it signed?" "No, ma'am." Miss Marple glanced at Rosalind, then back at Elsie. "You brought out the tea, yes?" "Yes, ma'am. Tray was already in the kitchen. Thought it strange cups all mismatched like, but I didn't question it. Just did what I was told. And the note that summoned you. Do you still have it?" Elsie shook her head. "Didn't think it mattered once he was dead." Miss Marple reached across the table, patting her hand gently. "Thank you, Elsie. That's all I needed." When the woman had gone, Rosalind turned to her aunt. "She's clearly frightened. She's also telling the truth," Miss Marple replied. "She didn't poison that tea, but someone wanted her there, someone who needed the tray delivered without suspicion." "And the ring in the photo?" "Ah, yes." Miss Marple stood, walking over to a small wooden drawer in the corner of her sitting room. She opened it delicately and pulled out a faded church bulletin. "I've kept this from years ago, habit, I suppose. Read the engagement announcements." Rosalind scanned the list, and her eyes widened. "Sybil Ackerman, engaged to Alistair Hawthorne." Briefly, Miss Marple said. "It was ended before the wedding. Quietly, but not without pain. He married Eliza 2 years later, the same Eliza who wore the cameo ring that Sybil's grandmother once owned." Rosalind's voice dropped. "You think Sybil still holds a grudge?" "I think resentment ages differently in people," Miss Marple replied, looking thoughtful. "Sometimes it softens, sometimes it hardens, but it rarely disappears." She returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. "Whoever orchestrated this murder planned it weeks in advance, and that tray prepared early, set aside, not matching it, was never meant to feel natural. It was meant to confuse. Why? To hide the real clue," Miss Marple said. "Something so ordinary we would never question it. Like a photograph, a missing jar, a ring worn by the wrong hand, a guest who should not have been on the list at all." She paused, fingers still over the yarn, "and someone who most certainly was." Chapter 5. Confrontations and Secrets. Be Friday morning. The air in Heathercombe carried a noticeable tension, like a string pulled just taut enough to sing. The village's quaint charm had taken on an edge. Even the birdsong seemed less cheerful, as though the hedgerows themselves were holding their breath. Miss Marple spent the early part of the day in the churchyard, tending the roses beside her sister's grave with delicate precision. It was here she did her best thinking, among the quiet stones and the comfort of the dead, whose motives had long since expired. She clipped a dry blossom, then another, as fragments of memory arranged themselves like puzzle pieces in her mind. A ring in a photograph, a tray of mismatched cups, a maid summoned anonymously, a missing jar of nutmeg, and a woman with a reason to linger in the past. At precisely noon, Miss Marple arrived unannounced at Sybil Ackerman's cottage, a neat, red brick home with a trim front hedge and lace curtains that did nothing to obscure the fact that Sybil had been watching the street for hours. "Oh, Jane," Sybil said, flustered but forcing brightness into her voice. "Do come in. I was just steeping some Darjeeling." "How lovely," Miss Marple replied, stepping into the front room, where everything smelled faintly of lavender and something sharper, perhaps vinegar, perhaps regret. They sat by the window, Sybil poured the tea with a slightly trembling hand. No lemon? Miss Marple asked, glancing toward the tidy silver tray. I'm out, Sybil said quickly. Haven't been to the shop in days. Miss Marple nodded, not pushing. She let the silence sit for a few sips, then asked, very gently, did you love him? Sybil blinked. Pardon, Alistair. Did you love him? Once, the mask faltered. I was young. He was handsome, brilliant. Everyone said so. And yes, I suppose I did. But he changed. He became cold, dismissive, cruel even. You know he called off the engagement by letter? I'd heard, Miss Marple said softly. And then he married Eliza, and she wore my ring. My grandmother's cameo, passed down to me. He gave it to her as though it meant nothing. You never asked for it back? Sybil looked away. What would be the point? He never returned anything he took. They drank in silence a moment longer. Miss Marple set down her cup. You received an invitation. I did, and you came. Despite all that, Sybil's voice turned tight. I wanted to see the inside of that house one more time. I thought perhaps he'd ask forgiveness, but he didn't. No, she said bitterly. He didn't say anything to anyone. He just sat there, like a corpse pretending to breathe. Miss Marple studied her face. Do you still have the card? I burned it, Sybil said. I didn't want the memory. A pause. Did you notice the ring? Miss Marple asked. Sybil frowned. What ring? Eliza's ring. In the photograph on his sideboard. For a heartbeat, something flickered in Sybil's expression. A tightening round the mouth. Then it vanished. No, she said. I didn't look closely. Miss Marple rose. Thank you for the tea, dear. And the honesty. Sybil stood too, wary. Do you think I had something to do with it? Miss Marple smiled sweetly. I think heartbreak never forgets. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Reverend Willoughby, under the pretense of asking about floral arrangements for the upcoming parish fundraiser. The Reverend's housekeeper, Miss Finch, answered the door and escorted her inside, where she was greeted by the comforting scent of wood polish and theological dust. Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple said, seated in the study, but I was hoping to ask you about the Hawthorns, particularly Mrs. Hawthorn. Before her death, Reverend Willoughby, a kindly man with thinning hair and too many bookmarks in his Bible, sighed. A sad business that. Eliza was a complicated soul, graceful, but, well, quietly troubled. I always suspected something wasn't quite right in that marriage. Miss Marple nodded. Did she ever come to you for counsel? Once, she spoke of feeling watched in her own home, of being replaced by Sybil. She never said her name, only that Alistair still kept letters. Letters? Miss Marple asked, eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, love letters, Eliza claimed, locked in a drawer. She found them once, but never said what they said. Did anyone else know? Not that I'm aware. Eliza was private. I urged her to confront him, but she refused. And then, of course, she drowned. Terrible accident, or at least that's what they ruled it. Miss Marple took a moment to consider this. Were the letters ever found after her death? Willoughby frowned. No, the drawer was empty. That evening, as dusk settled over Heather Comby like a shawl, Miss Marple walked once more to Ivy Hollow, this time alone. The key had been left with Sergeant Chooks for final inspection, and she'd obtained permission to take one last look. Inside, the house was as still as memory. She went straight to the study, to the old writing desk near the window. She opened each drawer with care, nothing inside but empty inkwells. A faded blotter and a tarnished letter opener dot them. Beneath the bottom drawer, her fingers found a false panel dotted clicked outward with a soft pop. Inside were several folded letters, tied with a dark green ribbon. The paper was yellowed but intact, the handwriting unmistakably delicate. She untied the ribbon, scanning the first few lines. They were from Sybil, Passionate, emotional, and never sent. Not love letters from Sybil to Alistair. Love letters from Sybil to Eliza. Miss Marple's eyes widened, not in shock, but in clarity. She folded the letters carefully, retying the ribbon and returning them to their hiding place. This was no longer a story of rejection alone, that it was a story of betrayal, and longing, and secrets buried deeper than marriage, and someone, perhaps more than one, who could not let the past remain in peace outside. The wind stirred the ivy along the windows, whispering softly against the glass. Miss Marple stepped back into the hallway, where shadows fell long and thin. It was time to draw out the truth, not by accusation, but by observation. Not by demanding answers, but by inviting someone to betray themselves. Chapter 6. A stitch in time. Morning after Inspector Cray's formal questioning, the village of Muchwood awoke not to the hum of ordinary life, but to the subtle tension that clung like a mist above the dew-covered hedgerows. Curtains twitched earlier than usual, kettles boiled with more urgency, and post was received with a peculiar sort of anxiety. There were whispers outside the bakery and long pauses in conversation at the grocer's, where glances darted and suspects were silently chosen and discarded like bruised apples. Miss Marple, on the other hand, took her tea quietly on the vicariage's sunny back veranda, where she had been staying during her short visit to Muchwood. The cup rattled gently in its saucer as she stared across the garden with a distant gaze, not vacant, but full of quiet precision. Her mind had long since stopped entertaining the idea of Howard's murder being a random act. The anonymous invitation, the peculiar arrangement of the seating, and now the inconsistencies in stories, each thread frayed in a way that set her knitting fingers twitching. She set down her cup and picked up her embroidery hoop instead. Cross-stitch helped her think. While most people believed that an aging spinster stitching away in a wicker chair wasn't capable of much outside jam-making and gossip, Miss Marple found it to be the perfect disguise for close and undetected observation. At precisely 10 o'clock, a soft rap sounded on the garden gate. It creaked open to reveal Eliza Bloom, the local seamstress, plump, pink-cheeked, and as tightly laced and corsely as she was in her opinions. "Oh, Miss Marple," Eliza said, breathless from her short walk. "I know it's a bit early, but I couldn't help myself. I just had to speak to someone sensible." "Do come in, Miss Bloom," said Miss Marple with warmth, gesturing to the wicker chair opposite her. Tea. Eliza declined with a fluttering hand and sat down with an audible sigh. "I keep thinking about that poor man," she began, "Mr. Howard, and about that dreadful night. You know, it's funny the way people acted. I mean, Mrs. Penrose was shaking, and she says it's nerves, but I've seen her face down the butcher's dog with a rolling pin. Doesn't strike me as a woman easily rattled." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her needle moving in a gentle rhythm. "And then there's young Peter Croft," Eliza continued, lowering her voice. "He was pacing the edge of the lawn before the murder. I saw him from the hedge when I arrived late. Looked like a man ready to bolt, and yet he said he was with Mrs. Langley the whole time." Miss Marple noted gently, without looking up from her hoop. "Exactly. And speaking of the Langleys," Eliza leaned in conspiratorially, "Mr. Langley's been rather chummy with Dr. Brathwaite lately, always stopping by the surgery. Some say it's for arthritis, but I think it's more than bones creaking. People often underestimate how much pain can affect the temper," Miss Marple said, neatly tying off a thread. Eliza blinked. "Oh, yes, I suppose." After a few more minutes of pleasant but mostly speculative conversation, Eliza departed, somewhat deflated by Miss Marple's outward placidity. As the gate closed behind her, Miss Marple paused in her work. It wasn't what Eliza had said, it was what she hadn't. Something about that hedge. Why had she arrived late? And if she'd seen Peter pacing before the incident, why hadn't she mentioned it to the inspector? She stood, returning her embroidery hoop to the basket beside her chair, and wandered inside. In the quiet of the vicariage's drawing room, she picked up the invitation card that had summoned her to the garden party. It was neatly printed, but something felt off about the quality. The card stock was thinner than what the Penroses typically used for their social events, an old habit Miss Marple remembered from past years, not to mention the ink smudged ever so slightly near the bottom edge. A newer printer, perhaps, or someone less familiar with high-quality invitations. Her thoughts were interrupted by the vicar himself, who entered with a worried expression and his walking stick tucked beneath one arm. "Jane, my dear," he said, "I've just had a most distressing visit from Inspector Cray. It seems they're beginning to focus on poor Lucy Penrose. He thinks her behavior is evasive." Miss Marple tilted her head. Has she said anything in her own defense? Only that she'd stepped away during the toast to fetch her shawl. She says she caught a chill. He hesitated. But Cray is convinced she used the opportunity to slip away unnoticed. She's not a violent woman. Miss Marple mused. Though grief and desperation can manifest in surprising ways, she didn't even cry at the scene. The vicar added, "Some found that strange. She's a woman who's lost a great deal of dignity over the years, Arthur. Sometimes tears don't come when expected." The vicar sighed. "I do hope you're looking into this. In your own gentle way, of course." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Always, that afternoon, under the guise of delivering a jar of raspberry jam, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Lucy Penrose. The house was quieter than usual, drawn inward like a person bracing against the cold. Lucy received her in the sitting room, where the heavy curtains had not been opened. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said kindly. "Not at all," Lucy replied, her voice thin. "Company is a welcome distraction. I brought some jam. I remember you always preferred raspberry." Lucy gave the smallest smile, and her hands trembled as she received the jar. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a few moments. Miss Marple allowed the quiet to stretch comfortably before she said, "You were fond of Howard, weren't you?" Lucy looked away. "He was my husband. That's not quite what I asked." Lucy closed her eyes. "I tried. I truly did. But something in him turned hard, Jane, after the war, especially. It wasn't just the business failures or the debts. There were things." "What kind of things?" "I don't know. Letters, meetings late at night, secrets. He kept secrets from me, even up to the day he died." Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. "And what about the invitation?" Lucy blinked. "What do you mean?" "To the garden party. Did you send them?" Lucy hesitated. "I thought my husband had arranged them." "I found the cards already addressed and stamped." A chill crept into Miss Marple's spine. That meant Howard hadn't received an anonymous invitation. He'd sent them without telling his wife. Or worse, someone else had created them under Lucy's nose. As she took her leave, Miss Marple's mind reeled. Something was terribly wrong with the invitation itself. It was the single false note that played beneath every interaction since the murder, and like a slipped stitch in a tapestry, it was where everything might unravel if she just tugged in the right place. Chapter 7. A slip of the tongue. The next morning, St. Mildred's was bathed in a crisp, golden light. Sunlight filtered through the mist, dappling the narrow lanes and stone walls with warmth. But the village's mood remained anything but bright. Curtains twitched, shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones, and the only cheerful thing on High Street was a ginger cat sunning itself outside the post office. At the Bluebell Cafe, usually bustling with chatter and clinking teacups, the usual din had dulled to whispers. A few villagers gathered around the newspaper stand, which carried a bold headline from the county press: "Murder in St. Mildred's. Identity of victim confirmed as Lady Margaret Langley." Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, knitting needles clicking softly as she sipped her morning tea. Her eyes scanned the street calmly, but behind them whirred 1,000 threads of thought. Inspector Cray arrived shortly after 9, his coat unbuttoned and an air of weariness hanging over him. He looked out of place, too stiff for the organic rhythms of St. Mildred's, but determined to impose some order on its chaos. Miss Marple greeted him with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Inspector. I expect your day's already quite full," he sighed. "More than full, Miss Marple. I've just returned from Langley Manor. The staff are terrified, rightly so, I suppose. Lady Margaret's death was not natural. The autopsy confirms it." Miss Marple didn't blink. "Poison, perhaps?" Cray raised an eyebrow. "You do have a talent for cutting through the fog." "Yes, a concentrated dose of belladonna, likely administered in her wine at the garden party." Miss Marple's knitting paused, just for a moment. "A potent and old-fashioned choice, easily hidden, especially if one knows what to look for in the garden." Cray nodded grimly. Langley's gardener mentioned a missing cluster of deadly nightshade from the hedge, bordering the southern edge of the estate. Said it went missing 2 days before the party, and no one thought to mention it until now. She asked mildly. "Well, no one imagined a murder. It was chalked up to naughty children or foxes." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Isn't it fascinating how things only become important in hindsight?" Cray leaned in. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. There's something curious. No one claims to have invited Lady Margaret to the party. Not the Fletchers, not the church committee. She simply showed up." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet she arrived with such confidence. One would assume her presence was expected." "She told Mrs. Fletcher she received a handwritten note," Cray said, "but no one's seen it. It wasn't found on her body, which means someone lured her there," Miss Marple said, her tone even. "With intent." Cray nodded grimly. "That's what I fear. We've started questioning all the party guests, but I'm afraid everyone has an opinion and no memory." Miss Marple gave a soft chuckle. "That sounds very much like St. Mildred's." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the village library, where Agnes Roper, the librarian, stood shelving a stack of books with nervous energy. Agnes was a pale, thin woman with anxious fingers and a tendency to whisper even when no one else was around. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, "I heard about the autopsy. It's so frightful. Poison. I keep thinking, what if she wasn't the intended victim?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, what makes you say that?" Agnes glanced about and leaned in. "It's only, well, I thought Lady Margaret looked flustered when she arrived. She came in late and barely said hello. But there was a moment just after she stepped onto the lawn when her eyes met Eleanor Broomfield's, and I swear something passed between them." "Miss Broomfield from the antique shop?" "Yes," Agnes whispered. "She's not usually invited to church events, you know. She's only recently moved here. But she was at the party, sitting quite close to where the wine glasses were set." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Miss Broomfield and Lady Margaret, did they know each other before?" "I don't think so," Agnes said, then hesitated. "But then I overheard Eleanor saying something out at the party. She said, I knew she wouldn't be able to keep quiet forever. She said it to no one in particular, just muttering while staring at the garden." Miss Marple thanked her, her expression calm. "Such things are worth remembering, Miss Roper. They tend to matter, eventually, by evening." The village hall had become the site of an informal gathering. Not an official meeting, just villagers pretending to be there for a bake sale committee, all with urgent theories about the murder. Miss Marple entered quietly, taking her usual seat near the fire exit. Her rival sparked a ripple of whispered greetings, but she offered only polite nods. Harold Wainwright, the butcher, puffed on his pipe and declared, "It must be that gardener, Jenkins. Who else would know how to handle deadly plants?" "Don't be absurd," huffed Mrs. Ellison. "It's always the quiet ones. That librarian girl, what's her name, Agnes? She's got shifty eyes, Eleanor Broomfield. Sitting further back, remained silent, but Miss Marple noticed the stiff set of her shoulders and the tight grip on her handbag. Then, a clumsy moment, Dr. Rowley, flushed with wine and indignation, muttered, "If Margaret hadn't come sniffing about, none of this would have happened." The room went silent. Miss Marple turned to him, her tone gentle. "Sniffing about what, Dr. Rowley?" The doctor's eyes widened. "I just meant she had a way of poking into people's business. She was always accusing someone of something. You know how she was?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, eyes steady. "But it's one thing to be curious, and quite another to know something worth silencing." The remark lingered. Eleanor Broomfield stood abruptly and left the hall, her heels clicking on the stone floor. Miss Marple watched her go, lips pursed thoughtfully. The web was tightening. Someone had lured Lady Margaret to that party. Someone who feared what she might reveal. And now, that same someone might just have let something slip. Chapter 8, a letter out of 10th village of Little Dithering, had slipped into that curious blend of excitement and dread only a murder could summon. Curtains twitched more frequently, whispers carried through hedgerows, and the church bake sale was suddenly underattended. Though everyone was just terribly busy, you understand. In the midst of it all, Miss Marple remained her usual gentle self, knitting in her sunroom, listening quietly during tea visits, and reflecting on the curious collection of humans who made up her village. Most would have dismissed her presence entirely, but if they had paid closer attention, they might have noticed that her needles moved faster when a name was mentioned, or how she occasionally paused in mid-purl, as if struck by some invisible thread of deduction. But this morning, she wasn't knitting. She was standing by her mantelpiece, delicately inspecting a curious envelope that had been slipped through her door. Just after breakfast. The envelope was creamy white, thick, the sort used for formal correspondence. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the sort one might find in a governess's report from 1885. It simply read, "Miss Jane Marple, urgent. Do not delay." She opened it carefully, unfolding the note with the precision of someone used to finding meaning in small things. "Dear Miss Marple, I believe I have remembered something terribly important, something I'd forgotten about the night of the party. I cannot say it here. Please come to the gardener's cottage before noon. It concerns the dead girl. Yours in haste. See no signature, no return address." But the C could only be one person, Constance Ridley, the widow of the late Dr. Ridley, now living in the old gardener's cottage behind what had once been the Ridley estate. Constance had withdrawn in recent years, growing rather eccentric. She kept hens, spoke to her dead husband aloud in the garden, and once accused the vicar's cat of espionage. Nevertheless, Miss Marple wasted no time. By 10 minutes past 11, she was already on the narrow path past the orchard, hat secured with a pin, and a parcel of buttered scones in her basket. Always best to arrive with something, in case things turned awkward. When she reached the gardener's cottage, however, it was oddly still. The curtains were drawn, and the door was slightly ajar. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment, then pushed gently. "Constance?" she called, her voice soft but clear. No answer. She stepped inside. The air was stale with yesterday's stew and something faintly floral. On a small table near the fireplace, a tea tray sat untouched, 2 cups, one still steaming slightly. That was odd. Miss Marple's eye was drawn immediately to the back room, where the curtain swayed just slightly. She approached. "Constance?" She tried again. It was then that she saw her sitting in an armchair by the window, a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her head tilted as if listening to something far away. But she wasn't listening. She wasn't breathing either. Constance Ridley was dead. Miss Marple stood very still for a moment. She took in the unnatural stillness of the body, the spilled tea at her feet, the faint scent of almonds in the air. Almonds, cyanide, She murmured that she did not scream or rush. She simply stepped back, closed the curtain over the doorway, and walked briskly to the telephone. By the time Inspector Cray arrived, Miss Marple had already jotted down her observations on a small notepad and poured herself a sensible cup of tea. Cray entered like a man chasing his own shadow. "Another one," he said grimly. "And I suppose you found her?" "I did," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "She had written to me, asked me to come, said she remembered something important about the party. Suicide?" Cray muttered. Miss Marple gave him a patient look. "I'm afraid not, Inspector. If she was planning to kill herself, I very much doubt she'd arrange for company. Constance had her eccentricities, but she was not the sort for theatrics, and she brewed 2 cups of tea." Cray frowned. "You're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Miss Marple said calmly. "Merely observing. There's a difference." He sighed, rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, this certainly complicates things. First that poor girl in the orchard. Now this, it simplifies things, actually," she said, sipping her tea. "If we assume Miss Ridley was murdered to prevent her from speaking, well, then the list of people who feared what she might say is rather shorter than the list of those who attended the party." Cray gave her a narrowed look. "You're not suggesting someone killed that girl and now Ridley to cover it up?" "I'm merely suggesting," she said, "that the first murder was untidy, and the second, well, it smacks of desperation, don't you think?" Cray stared at her. "Miss Marple, you don't think the killer is still among us?" "Oh, Inspector," she said with a sad smile. "In Little Dithering? I should say it's practically guaranteed." He left shortly after to interview neighbors and secure the scene. Miss Marple remained behind for a while, watching the wind tease the leaves outside the window where Constance had died. The old woman had known something. She'd remembered, and now she was silenced. Miss Marple opened her notebook again and underlined one line from the letter. "Something I'd forgotten about the night of the party. What could one forget, and then remember, and then die for?" As she walked home through the orchard path, her thoughts wandered back to the guest list who had been invited and, more curiously, who had not. That, she thought, might prove even more telling. Because in Little Dithering, one never truly forgot. One only chose when to remember. And someone very clever indeed had just killed again to make sure one more memory never resurfaced, but Miss Marple had already begun to remember it for them. Chapter 9. A second invitation. Following morning arrived shrouded in fog, as if the village itself were trying to withhold its secrets beneath a thick gray veil. The mist curled along the cobblestones, lingered on windowsills, and muffled the early sounds of village life. Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, her tea steeping beside her, a slice of brown bread and marmalade untouched on her plate. The newspaper lay unopened. For once, she wasn't interested in crosswords or births, deaths, and marriages. Her mind had been circling like a kestrel in the dusk, hovering over to deaths and the space between them. Verity Hale in the orchard, Constance Ridley in her armchair, one murdered in haste, the other in fear. And now, a letter had been posted under her door again. This time the envelope was pale blue. The paper inside was crisp and clean, the handwriting more modern, careful, almost as if the writer had tried too hard to appear casual. "Miss Marple, I believe you are closer to the truth than you realize. The orchard was not an accident. Come to the old Ridley greenhouse tonight at 7 p.m. Come alone." Burn this? Miss Marple didn't burn it. She tucked it between pages for 123 and for 124 of Herbal Remedies Through the Ages, where she kept other curious notes over the years and solved riddles in polite cursive. She glanced at the clock. Barely past 8 in the morning. 12 hours until the meeting. 12 hours for someone to decide she'd become too dangerous. By noon, She was standing outside the post office under the pretense of posting a birthday card to her cousin Lottie, who had been dead since 1963. Waiting for a glimpse of particular faces, she saw Mrs. Phipps exchanging gossip near the grocer, the Reverend's wife carrying an enormous parcel wrapped in brown paper, and young Timothy Bell, the mail carrier, slipping letters into the red box with mechanical diligence. She called him over. "Timothy, dear," she said sweetly, "you wouldn't happen to recall who posted this letter to me yesterday, would you?" Timothy scratched behind his ear, suddenly self-conscious. "Well, now, I'm not sure I should say, Miss Marple." She smiled. "You'd be helping the police, dear." He brightened. "Oh, in that case, it were Mr. Ellison's girl, Tilly, the youngest one. She handed it to me just before supper and said it was a special errand from her cousin in Finchley." "Did she now?" Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "And did she say who the cousin was?" "No, ma'am, but I remember she seemed a bit flushed. Thought maybe she'd run all the way to the post box." Miss Marple thanked him and went on her way. Tilly Ellison, barely 15, and known mostly for painting her nails an outrageous shade of green and sneaking cigarettes behind the chapel. No cousin in Finchley, but someone in the village must have asked her to deliver the note. Someone hoping to stay invisible. That narrowed the field. Back home, Miss Marple opened a slim notebook and wrote a single sentence. A killer must either hide in silence or speak in riddles. She tapped the pen once against the edge of the table. Then she began a list, a careful, unsparing inventory of everyone who had attended the Ridley Garden party 3 weeks ago. Then another list those who had not been present, and at the very bottom of the second list, she added a new name, Harold Ridley. It was a name that had been strangely absent from all the whispering. The Ridley's only son, long removed to London and estranged from his mother. He had not returned for his father's funeral last spring, nor had he been seen in Little Dithering in over 4 years. But 3 days before Verity Hale was found dead in the orchard, someone matching his description had been seen at the old Ridley estate by the milkman, who swore a tall man with city shoes had stood smoking by the broken fountain, looking as though he might drown in his own thoughts. Harold Ridley had not attended the garden party, but he may very well have watched it from the wood's dot as the evening approached. Miss Marple prepared herself with quiet precision. No fanfare, just a torch tucked into her handbag, sensible shoes, and a brooch with a tiny knife hidden inside the clasp, a wartime gift from an old friend in espionage. She doubted she'd need it, but one never knew. At exactly 10 minutes before 7, she stepped into the misty twilight and made her way toward the old greenhouse. The structure, long abandoned, sat just beyond the orchard, its panes cracked or missing, its frame bowed under years of neglect. Creeping vines had overtaken one side, clawing up the glass like green fingers inside. The air was humid and smelled of earth and rust. Dead leaves littered the floor. The place hummed faintly with the sound of insects and old metal remembering how to creak. She waited. 7 o'clock came. Then 5 minutes passed. Then 10. At 11 minutes past 7, she heard its soft footsteps crunching along the path. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows. A figure appeared in the greenhouse doorway, tall, lean, wearing a long coat and hat pulled low. He did not step inside. Instead, he slipped an envelope through the broken frame and vanished. Miss Marple waited another full minute before moving. When she picked up the envelope, she noted the handwriting immediately neat, angled, vaguely familiar. Inside was a single sentence, typed. The girl knew something she shouldn't have. The widow was about to say it. But you, Miss Marple, you already know. I suggest you forget it. There was no signature. Miss Marple held the letter in gloved fingers, considering. So, a warning, or perhaps an invitation of another kind. She walked home the long way, circling the orchard, where the moon lit the ground in silver fragments. The grass had begun to grow again over the spot where Verity Hale had been found. Someone was afraid, not just cautiously afraid, and fear made people reckless that it was no longer about the party. It was about a truth buried long before that. Something Verity had uncovered, something Constance had nearly remembered, and something Miss Marple would now refuse to forget. As she stepped through her front gate, she found another surprise, a small envelope. No address, no stamp, just her name, written in childish scrawl. Inside was a drawing done in red crayon. It showed a tree, a girl hanging from it, and a man standing below, holding a spade. At the bottom, a single word, soon. Miss Marple folded the paper and placed it in the same book, between the same pages. Her kettle was still warm, and she poured herself another cup. Then she picked up her knitting. The stitch pattern had changed. Now it was a lattice interwoven, delicate, easily missed if not seen from the right angle. She smiled to herself. The killer thought they were ahead, but Miss Marple was already stitching the truth together. Chapter 10. The truth beneath the teacups. Sitting room at Ivy Cottage was unusually quiet. Outside, the village of Nethermead hummed with its usual mid-morning activity. Bicycles creaked down cobblestone lanes, and the occasional dog barked at fluttering laundry. But within Miss Marple's floral wallpapered sitting room, 5 people sat in tight, tense silence. Chief Inspector Cray, fidgeting with his pen, looked unsure whether he had come to observe or to intervene. Colonel Baxter sat ramrod straight, his weathered hands gripping his knees. Mrs. Denham, pale but composed, stared at the tea tray as if willing it to offer distraction. Young Thomas Fenwick looked flushed, his eyes darting between faces. And Lady Marchmont, ever the portrait of elegance, sipped her tea with the nonchalance of a woman accustomed to scandal. Miss Marple poured herself a cup with gentle precision, the clink of porcelain against silver breaking the silence. She looked up with her usual mild smile. "I do thank you all for coming. I thought, in the spirit of community, it might be helpful to clarify a few things, if only to ease our collective nerves. It's been such a trying week, hasn't it?" Lady Marchmont raised an eyebrow. "Surely you're not going to suggest we know anything more than the police already do." "Oh, I would never suggest such a thing," said Miss Marple sweetly. "Only that sometimes the police don't know what they're not looking for." Cray cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, if you have something to say, I suggest you get to it." She nodded and folded her hands primly. "Very well. Let's start with the matter of the invitation." Thomas's brow furrowed. "The invitation no one sent." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Hargrove received a letter inviting him to Lady Marchmont's garden party. We know it was delivered. We know he believed it came from her. And we know he died mere moments after arriving. But what we failed to ask is who stood to benefit from him coming at all." Lady Marchmont opened her mouth, but Miss Marple held up a hand. "I found it curious," she continued, "that the invitation was written on Lady Marchmont's personal stationery, but contained a subtle misspelling of her middle name. Easily overlooked unless, of course, you've seen it correctly printed 1,000 times, like someone in her household staff might have, or someone who had been involved in preparing invitations before." A beat passed. "Go on," said Cray. Sitting forward, Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Denham. "My dear, you mentioned once how fond you were of sorting Lady Marchmont's correspondence before you married the vicar, but I believe your relationship with the Marchmont household went deeper than you've let on, didn't it?" Mrs. Denham's lips thinned. I was a companion, yes, a sort of paid friend, before my marriage, and you would have had access to her stationery cabinet." Mrs. Denham didn't reply. Miss Marple continued gently. "You also mentioned your late husband, the vicar, had long disapproved of Mr. Hargrove. that he believed Hargrove had taken advantage of a vulnerable young woman years ago. A girl from the village who eventually left disgraced and penniless. Mrs. Denham's face turned pale. Her name was Lydia, Miss Marple said quietly. And she was your sister, wasn't she? A sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Denham was the only reply. She never came back to Nethermead. Miss Marple said, but she wrote to you, didn't she? She told you what had happened. And when Hargrove returned after all these years, wealthy, charming, and completely unrepentant, you saw red. Colonel Baxter stood up abruptly. This is preposterous. There's no proof No, not proof, Miss Marple said calmly. Only human behavior. Only small things. Like the way Mrs. Denham always walked the long way around the green to avoid the post office, where Hargrove often loitered, or how she flinched when his name was mentioned, or how she knew exactly where the vicar kept the leftover cyanide for the garden pests. Thomas Fenwick spoke suddenly. You said the teacup showed no trace of poison. Indeed, said Miss Marple. Because it wasn't in the tea. It was in the sugar cube. Just one offered to Mr. Hargrove with charming hospitality by a helpful passerby at the party. She looked directly at Mrs. Denham. You slipped it to him, didn't you? Knowing he would take just one cube. You stood close. You saw it. You made sure. Mrs. Denham's shoulders slumped. Her hands trembled in her lap. I didn't mean to kill him, she said softly. I meant to frighten him. I meant to make him sick, so he'd leave. I wanted him to feel powerless the way Lydia had felt. But I misjudged the dose. Lady Marchmont put down her teacup with a clatter. So that's what all this has been about. Your sister's poor choices? She was 17, Mrs. Denham said coldly. And he promised to marry her. Cray stood, motioning toward the door. Mrs. Denham, I'm afraid you'll need to come with me. She nodded, rising with surprising dignity. Thank you, Miss Marple. I know you mean it to set things right. When the door closed behind them, silence fell once more. Colonel Baxter sighed heavily. I suppose you'll say this proves your point about village gossip being worth more than police legwork. Miss Marple smiled gently. Not at all. But sometimes understanding the why is more important than the how. Lady Marchmont stood, smoothing her gloves. Well, I must say, Jane, you've rather upstaged my entire social season. I do apologize, said Miss Marple with a twinkle. But at least your next invitation list will be free of unpleasant surprises. When they had all gone, Miss Marple returned to her armchair and picked up her knitting. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, warming the garden with golden light. The village would, in time, forget the details. New gossip would replace the old. But Miss Marple, as always, would remember. Because people, she knew, never really changed. And in the quiet spaces between tea and toast, someone was always watching.